Put yourself in your customer's shoes. And if you cannot do that, you got to find someone who can. Because once you are in their shoes, then you can, you know what you need to do and say to sort of earn their trust and then keep their trust.
Hi, I'm Tino Mantella, and welcoming you to the 11th edition of Leading with Relevance. This is a podcast series featuring some of today's most prominent leaders, people that are busting through the status quo and impacting companies and impacting communities. Our goal is to interview people that highlight their personal and professional journeys and learning about their why, as Simon Sinek would say. For the listeners, we hope that you'll have practical insights that you can apply to your pathway and your journey to leadership. So I'm loving the opportunity to talk to and learn from leaders. And so each podcast episode runs about 20 minutes, but don't leave, because you can also go on our website and get a larger, longer version of the program. So today I have the pleasure of interviewing Lynn Laube, who is now a partner with TTV. Prior to that, she very recently, in fact, she served as operating partner for Valor VC. She currently supports Valor as an investor. She's also the co-founder of Cardlytics. She's one of the few women in the country that has taken their company from startup to public. One of the top minds in the fintech space. That's how, when I ran the Technology Association of Georgia, I got to know Lynn and Cardlytics. Celebrated for her leadership and innovation, Lynn was named one of Inc. magazine's Inspiring Women to Watch and received Georgia's Women of Technology Women of the Year Award. She's also been recognized one of the top 10 venture-backed female founders by Inc. magazine and Entrepreneur 360. She's passionate about helping entrepreneurs succeed and championing minority and women-owned businesses. Lynn also serves on the board of directors for NerdWallet. So Lynn, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I like to start with the early years, right? So the early part of your life, what shaped you?
Sure.
Three people that influenced you?
I was not necessarily overly influenced by any particular person.
Okay.
But what really shaped me was the fact that I moved 17 times before I was 18, including 3 different high schools. And at the time it was terrible. But what I realized looking back in hindsight is it was, it helped me be more of a risk taker. It helped me learn how to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations. I think it prepared me, and that is one of the biggest things that influenced me.
You were raised in New England, but I guess that's not exactly accurate because you were raised all over. You picked University of Cincinnati. Why did you pick that school?
It was terrible 17-year-old logic. At the time, we were living in Cleveland, Ohio, and Cincinnati was the furthest away from my parents' in-state tuition. Again, Cincinnati, one of the things that I believe in is grit. You really need grit. And I think that is the thing that really shaped me in my early years, and even my selection of college. And frankly, even, my choice to go to Capital One, which sounds like a brilliant choice now, but at the time it was insane.
So Capital One, you were there when it was really a startup. So
Yep.
At that time, when you were in school, did you see a path to starting your own company? Was that a dream that you had, or just kind of grew into that?
No, I mean, I always knew I had an entrepreneurial spirit. I was a paper girl when I was 10. I was always making my own money and doing stuff. But I don't know that was ever really a dream necessarily. I started my career at Bank One. And what I realized after a couple of years is this is not for me. I need more risks. I need more excitement. And so when I got the phone call to come work for this crazy startup that, really didn't even have a name yet. And what I was told is, we're going to democratize lending. And that was it. Yeah. And so Capital One really invented and created this concept of risk-based lending, which really saves Americans millions, billions of dollars. And that was very compelling to me. And, it was the first big risk I think I ever took in my professional career, for sure. And it certainly paid off.
So you had a number of different roles at Capital One, right?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about how, you went through the ranks and then you, was Cardlytics right after Capital One? Yeah. So
I was very fortunate. Capital One's an amazing organization, and I was there as they were exploding in growth. And so you couple those two things, and yeah, I had a wild ride. It was unbelievable. Every 18 months I was doing something different. I had the opportunity to go, build their business in the UK. So I lived there for 3 years. But Capital One was very much the philosophy of you.
how did you move from Capital One, the kernel of the idea around Cardlytics? How did that all start?
Yeah. So my co-founder and I were working on a product called decoupled debit at Capital One. At the crux, Capital One was trying to figure out if they wanted to establish a debit relationship with the consumer. But in doing that, we started looking at debit accounts, which are very different than credit card accounts. This is back in 2007, right? Debit card was just starting to explode. And what we saw looking at the debit data was, oh my God, this is where people are spending all their money. This is how they use their everyday spend. We were actually looking at individual consumer accounts, and you could tell, this is a college student. This is probably a mom with 2 kids, just by looking at their spend. Yeah. And then the other kernel of the idea, this is at the same time that online banking was starting to take off. And every bank in the country considered it another cost center. So the idea was, this data is incredibly valuable. Let's use it. And who wants this data? Marketers. Let's use it to bring economics from a different industry inside banking and really help them monetize their online channels and deepen the relationship with their consumers. That was the core idea. That's how we came up with it.
So for the people listening, you had quite a journey from startup to public company, one of less than 30 women that have ever done that. You've got to be so proud of that. We're proud of you. Talk about challenges along the way.
I remember that. Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. I mean, look, there were a million challenges. I called them near-death experiences. Every startup is going to have them. And here's the thing, they never go away. I remember the day after the IPO. It was an amazing day. So exciting. We were so exhausted, but it was just awesome. And the next day, everything was the same. It's just another financing event. So I think that's the biggest thing I've learned is it is truly a marathon. It's not a sprint. Yeah. Don't start a company if you think you're going to get lucky and sell it in 2 years for 50 million to Google. That's not why you do this. And you really got to have the attitude that this is very much a journey. You have to have grit and you have to have balance. And you've got to be in it for the long term.
How did you, keep the company going, make sure the stakeholders were engaged and supportive? And I know you guys were really big on.
If you think about what Cardlytics did, we didn't just create a company, we created an industry. So when we first marched into banks and said, we're going to help you monetize your channels and bring economics from advertising into banking and deepen your relationships with your customers, most of them threw us out and said, there's no way we're ever going to give you access to our data or our customers. But Scott and I understood bankers. We'd been in their shoes. And that's put yourself in your customer's shoes. And if you cannot do that, you got to find someone who can. Because once you are in their shoes, then you can, you know what you need to do and say to sort of earn their trust and then keep their trust. And that's where the radical execution came into place. If we had one small error, the banks would freak out. They were giving us access to all their data and all their customers. So we had to act like a public company from day one, in terms of the execution, the processes, the transparency to the banks, because otherwise they wouldn't have worked with us.
So, following Cardlytics exit, how do you decide to move into the venture space?
From my perspective, it's a paying it forward. As you mentioned, there are very few women. There are very few people who did what we did, right? Building a company from nothing to post IPO. There are very few women who did it. Yeah. So, and certainly in Atlanta, there's even fewer. So I feel it's my obligation to help other founders. There are so many lessons I learned along the way that were hard to learn, but now they're easy to teach. And so I feel it's my obligation to work with younger, when I say younger, earlier in their career stages, founders, to help coach them. That's the only way we're going to get more women in power and more founders in Atlanta.
How did you guys kind of get started with the
Yeah,
program and funding
yeah.
and all of that?
My co-founder was a prior partner at Canaan, which is a very large VC on the West Coast. So we had an unfair advantage. They actually initially funded us. But
Oh,
I will tell you a story. We had a great term sheet from Canaan and an East Coast VC called Polaris.
yeah,
But they really wanted an Atlanta investor involved so that there was somebody who could like see us and touch us and feel us. You know what I mean? Not literally, but
yeah.
and so we shopped our deal all over Atlanta. All the people that you still hear about today who are known as legendary investors, we got kicked out of every one of them.
Oh man.
Every one of them. So we ended up with a way less better deal because we couldn't find an Atlanta VC.
You and I know the journey of the Atlanta technology community and the investor
Yep.
community. Do you think it's gotten better? I mean, we helped start Venture Atlanta and
Yes, I think it's gotten dramatically better. I mean, I still, at the core, believe Atlanta is still a big company town.
yeah.
And it's a journey they're still going through, but the startup ecosystem actually exists here today. It did not 15 years ago. So I think Atlanta has come a very long way. And I think the Southeast in general has come a very long way. But there's still challenges with, there's still not enough money here to keep the successful companies here. We still have a ways to go, but it's dramatically better than it was.
For the younger startups, then would you say that there's still some pressure, or there was at that time, if you're getting an investment from Boston or California or Dallas or wherever, that you're going to get pulled there?
I don't know that you get pulled there. So I think a lot of that has actually changed over the years, but there is still that challenge. If you are wildly successful, if you're one of those companies that has to raise 100 million, you're going to have to go outside of Atlanta.
If I had $100 for every time somebody mentioned AI, I'd probably be
Yeah.
So talk about how, you see things changing in terms of what you did at Cardlytics, and of course you're an investor now, so
Yeah.
technology is evolving.
Listen, technology, including AI, has evolved to such a point. If we were starting Cardlytics today, we could do it at a tenth of the money and with a tenth of the people. It is something to be embraced. AI is here to stay. And so it's something you need to embrace. You need to use it. There's a new metric that investors are starting to look at very seriously now, which is revenue per employee. That was not a thing when we were building Cardlytics, but now it is not just, are you profitable? It is every person in that company delivering huge amounts of revenue. The only way you really can do that is with AI. So embrace AI. Flip side is every investor expects you to be able to talk about how you're intelligently using AI in your business.
Switching gears a little bit. So you've been a champion of women for as long as I've known you, and I think you had something at Cardlytics called Women of Cardlytics. So what advice would you give women who are aspiring to lead in technology? It's a big question, obviously.
At the core, I believe most men really do want women to succeed. And I also believe that men and women are very different. And so my advice in leadership is always to assume the best intent. I truly believe that if somebody says something that offends you, chances are they didn't even know. If you assume positive intent and you're very deliberate about having conversations when it felt like positive intent didn't happen, whether they treated you differently because you were women or whatever it might be, have those conversations professionally and in a very closed setting. You got to get comfortable in your own skin first, and then you got to be comfortable with, confronting these issues. They will happen, by the way. Racism and sexism are unfortunately very, very real. So don't think it's not going to happen. The question is, how are you going to handle it?
You're an investor now. You've been an investor for a while.
Yeah.
How do I put this? Are women coming in as prepared when they're making their pitches? And
I think, yes, they are as prepared when they get a seat at the table.
Okay.
They get fewer seats at the table. And I think it's in part because sometimes they're afraid to ask, and in part because there is still some, biases in the system. But women are very well prepared. Women can be just as good founders as men. They can do all the same things as men.
So for fintech founders, people know that Atlanta and Georgia is a big payments fintech leader. We
Yep,
made that
yep.
up a tag. What are some common good things you've seen and mistakes you've observed from other companies and how to navigate those challenges?
There's multiple mistakes, but I think kind of the two most common that I see, one is they get money and they spend it like crazy. I say you've got to hire slow and fire fast. And I think too often founders even believe their own enthusiasm. We've all created the plans and then realize we're not going to make anywhere close to those plans. You got to have the ambition and you got to have lofty goals, but you have to have realistic expectations on how long the money's going to last. And I think that's a big mistake that I see. And then the second big mistake that I see, especially with fintech founders, they are true subject matter experts in something, which is how they came up with the idea. They don't know how to sell. And I see this over and over again with startups who don't get the right salesperson in place early enough. And just because you're the CEO doesn't mean you know how to sell. And I think way too many founders underestimate the sales process. And, too often I see founders who, feel like they can do it all. Now that's part of what being a founder is. You got to have that grit too, but it is a very common mistake to underestimate the need to sell and to find the right people to help you do that.
I think leaders have sometimes a different perspective on work-life balance, if that's a thing. So how would you respond to that?
You can't have it all. Pick what's important to you and let the rest go. Anyone says you can balance work, life, career. No, you can't. The way you balance it is you figure out what you're not going to do and not worry about it anymore.
So you've received a lot of awards. I covered some of those, 500 Most Powerful Leaders, Georgia's Women in Technology, so on and so forth. But those accolades, from you personally, how did that influence your work?
Awards are always great. But they have the risk of making you think you've already made it. And, humility, and it's just a really important trait for a founder. So, just stay humble. Those awards were amazing.
So talk about, in your journey, sponsors and mentors that have influenced you. And
the greatest mentor that I had through all of Cardlytics' journey was Mark Johnson, who's a partner at TTV.
Yeah.
But he was a founder himself. He started a company called Check Free, had a really successful exit as a sale. And then, went on to become a partner at TTV so he could coach and help other founders. Mark was amazing. He would give us advice and he didn't mince any words. And the reason he was so great is because he'd been in our shoes. And that's why I think it's just so important for founders to pay it forward, because there are so few people who've been in those shoes that it's our obligation to teach others.
I hear a lot about sponsors too. You kind of, to some degree, made your own path, but as I understand, a lot of times maybe it's a man or another woman, but somebody that actually brings you along and sponsors you. What do you see in that side of the equation?
I certainly didn't. My co-founder, we sponsored each other. We were co-founders, but I will say in my career at Capital One, I definitely saw, back to the whole, I think there are a lot of people who want to see other people succeed. I had so many mentors at Capital One that just really wanted to help me succeed. And that was amazing. And I think that's what we need to do for each other as much as possible.
So, leadership style. Can you reflect on some key lessons in your early career, and has your leadership style changed over time?
Yes, I think my leadership style, the thing that has not changed is I've always believed in transparency. I tell people, I give them as much information as I possibly can. Transparency goes a long way, because if people understand why you're doing what you're doing or making the decision you're making, they tend to want to follow you. So transparency has always been a common theme for me in leadership. As I've gotten older and more mature in my career, I have noticed that I listen a whole lot more than I talk. And I think that's really important. If you just sit back and listen, you can be a much more effective leader.
So, reflecting back on your tremendous career, is there one or two things you're most proud of?
I'm proud of the paying forward philosophy that I have. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of people who worked for me, and people who worked for me 25 years ago at Capital One, I'm still in touch with and still, help. And so I'm proud of, I think I really have had an impact for many people in their careers. And that makes me proud. Of course, I'm proud of what we did with Cardlytics. I mean, and like I said, the IPO was amazing. I made a couple acquisitions as CEO. Those closing dinners were amazing.
A lot of times we learn more from a failure or misstep than you do success. So do you have a story for us?
Oh my God, I have so many stories. I'll think back to some of my most recent failures because they happen all the time. Like I said, it's all, you can have a near-death experience 3 years after you go public. But I think the thing that I most learned is what I said earlier. You have to fire fast. You have to hire slow and you have to fire fast. When I think back to most of the really bad things that happened, a bad hiring decision or a series of bad hiring decisions usually was involved in those things. And it's not that the people were bad, but it was wrong person, wrong role, wrong time, and then bad things happen.
So hire, and then I think you're implying too that maybe you stuck with those people too long?
Always, and never on purpose, but I have, this sounds terrible, but I've never regretted firing someone the next day. And it's nothing personal. The person is a lovely human being, just wrong person, wrong job. But I see people agonize over, making a decision, and I see people not taking action. It can bring down a company.
There's a lot of new generations, and we have a lot of generations in the workforce right now.
Yeah,
Are you seeing different things that they want? You work with a lot of young people.
Yeah.
How would you describe, or are they the same?
I do think they're very different. I think it is very important to understand what motivates a younger person. It is very different, I think, than what you just used to motivate us. We used to be motivated by just climbing up the corporate ladder, right? These young people, they want experiences. They want their work to mean something. So you have to motivate them in a very different way than you do, people more older in their career. So they're different.
We talk a lot at Relevance about customer 360, how you impact the customer, really customers center of a lot of business and technology advancement. So how would you describe those two? Are you seeing companies come in with more of a focus on the customer, or even with Cardlytics, how to impact the customer?
I said it earlier, if you cannot put yourself in your customer's shoes completely, if you cannot understand their point of view, then you better find someone who can really darn fast. And to your point, that is really, I think, the essence of, good 360 is you really have people who understand what the customer needs and what they want and what they care about. And I think that's incredibly important.
So if you were starting a startup today, but where do you see the opportunities? Where would you, you talked about AI, but are there places that, in your investment side?
Yeah. Listen, AI is certainly an opportunity. The thing I always ask as an investor is this a product or is this a company? And I think that's the challenge with AI. Investors want to see you using it smartly. I don't know that everything you do in AI makes it a company, and so I see people come and say, we're going to automate this process and that's going to be a big company. No, it's not. But use those tools, use them wisely. But if I were starting a company again, which I'm seriously thinking about, I would first, take as little money as I think I need to prove the concept. Do not spend the money just because you have it. It would be the first thing I'd be thinking about. The second thing is the absolute right people. Instead of hiring 20 people around me, I'd rather hire 3 and really figure out the go-to-market before we try to blow the thing out, So, and then the third thing would be, and this is not going to be popular, but I think it's important that people have some in-person, contact, especially when you're doing a startup. So I would have requirements for people to be around, not 5 days a week, but people need to be in a room together, brainstorming and figuring out how to get this thing off the ground.
So, so a lot of times when money gets tight in a company, and I ran a leadership development company for 5 years before the roles I'm doing now. Leadership development, employee development is first to go. What's your philosophy been on that?
Well, we never had a ton of money to spend on that. Younger companies often don't. My philosophy has always been the manager is critical. And so I spent a lot of time laying out expectations for management. First part of it is you got to be transparent with them so they have all the information so they can effectively lead. But then you set out expectations. You lay out those expectations very clearly. But I think the relationship between the employee and the manager is one of the most important relationships that there is. If people don't like their boss, how can they like their job? And maybe not, they don't have to love their boss, but they at least have to respect their boss. And I think that's the way I think about leadership versus trying to teach it in a class.
And there's a lot of women that would like to be on corporate boards. I'm not sure if they know exactly how to get there, and On Board tries to help them. But have you seen some progress there? And what would your advice be for women particularly that want to get onto a corporate board?
My first piece of advice is be realistic. You're not going to get on a public company board just because you have subject matter expertise in something. And so my advice is be realistic about the likelihood of you really getting on a public company board. It's for most people, it's not going to happen. And then be realistic about why you want to in the first place and go see if you can find that opportunity somewhere else. By the way, if you find it somewhere else and you make a real mark, that's your best bet of then getting on a public company board, is you were a great board member somewhere else. I will tell you, I've had more fun getting re-engaged with my alma mater, seeing the students, seeing the incubator labs that they're having on campus now, hanging out with the deans and talking about, the next wave of education. It's awesome. And these universities need help. So, go talk to your alma mater.
So last question, just the message you want to leave, you someone deeply involved with mentoring future leaders. So what advice would you give those that are kind of starting in their career or even a little further along towards mid-career? But if you have one message for them, what would it be?
I mean, it's so hard to have one message. Grit. I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. It's not easy. I don't care what your job is. It's not easy. You're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days. But if you have aspirations to be somewhere, to get somewhere, even if that aspiration is I want to retire early, you just got to have grit to kind of get through it.
So Lynn, thank you for joining me on Leading with Relevance. I appreciate you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tino.